Well, good morning, everyone. How are we doing this morning? Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to be sharing today's word. As Lily said, we are starting a new series where it's called The Legacy of Love, and we're going to be journeying through different stories where we're going to look at the different stories of how they show the transformative power of love and its ability to leave a lasting impact in the lives of individuals, families, and communities. Now, speaking of impact, how many of you here ever thought about like what kind of impact you're going to leave in the lives of the people around you, or maybe, in your community, in your workplace? For me, like that's a question I've always thought about. Like, what kind of impact will I leave? Like, what am I going to do with my life? What kind of legacy do I want to leave behind? And what do I want to be remembered for? And so the first story we're going to look into is Abraham and the test of offering his son, his only son whom he loves, as a burnt offering. And Abraham is remembered for many things, a man of righteousness, a man of faith, and I guess a man who was challenged in offering his only son. And so everyone goes through tests. It's part of life. And tests either make us, they either break us, and sometimes we find ourselves tested in the things that are close to our hearts. And how we respond to tests oftentimes show what we're made out of. So characters in the Bible oftentimes experience tests to see if they can live up to God's intended purpose for humanity. So Matthew Henry, who is a British minister who's written Bible commentaries, he said that strong faith is often exercised with strong trials. So sometimes we have to go through fire to reveal the true nature of our faith and whether we have built a strong enough foundation of trust in the Lord. Now, it's safe to say that Abraham probably went through the ultimate test in his life. So let's read from Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 2. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." I mean, if I were to put myself in Abraham's shoes right about now, I would be filled with fear. I mean, it's like a stab in my heart, right? Asking me to give up my only son, stab the only son whom you love. Let's just twist the dagger in my heart a little bit more as a burnt offering. I'm asked to give up the thing closest to my heart right now. I would be scared. Fear, it can drive behavior. Like, for example, our nervous systems are naturally wired to sense fear. And so our fear response is a survival mechanism to tell us to remain alert and avoid dangerous situations. Fear is used in punishments and threats and ultimatums, right? To get you to motivate to get something done to avoid retribution. Like, how many of you are familiar with the phrase, "if looks can kill"? Right? How many of you know that a mother's look can definitely kill? Especially that's one, for example, if I'm worshiping Jesus because my mom is looking at me. That's why my hands are up. So, a mother's look can kill. So, or actually just realized this, that flash sales uses fear to drive behavior. Basically, they're having, all these things on sale for a short period of time. And basically the idea is that, if you don't buy, you're going to miss out. It creates a sense of urgency. Humans value something that's rare. Have I bought things that I don't need because of sales? 100% yes. Have I bought shoes, more than one pair of shoes? My dad's like, "How many shoes do you need?" So yes, I blame the fear that, I'm missing out on the sale. I love sales. So yes, if you need to know when a sale is, I can tell you. I have this sixth sense for that. So anyways, when Abraham was presented with the test of offering his only son, whom he loves, as a burnt offering, fear can very well drive his behavior. Like, he can respond one of three ways. Option one, he could be like, "Let me take my son and run." All right, maybe if I run to the ends of the earth, God won't find me. He won't ask me for my son, and we good. All is well. Option two, he could be like, "What kind of God are you? Are you psychotic? You told me I'm going to have a son, and now you're taking it away." Like, he could get super angry with God. Or option three, he could bargain. Like, "Hey, I just sent my other son Ishmael into the desert. How about you take him instead? You already got rid of him, right? Or how about a choice lamb from my flock? 2, perhaps. So he could do one of 3 options. No one would say, offer my son as a burnt offering. Yeah, sure, that's reasonable. Take him and go. No, that's not reasonable. So, but Abraham, he's asked for the son that he's waited ages for, right? And it's not like Sarah can pop out another son. I mean, the woman is old, all right? And also, God fulfilling his covenant is contingent on Isaac. So, but what do we see Abraham do? So let's read Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. So just before he was about to slaughter his son, the angel of the Lord called up to him from heaven. And we see this in verse 12. He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." So Abraham, he did respond in fear, but he responded with the right kind of fear, the fear of the Lord. And so when Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son, the fear that he had wasn't one where he was afraid of God or, how he was going to, maybe he's going to get punished if he doesn't do as he's told by God. But he responded with a fear that loves God. Now, what is the fear of the Lord, right? It's not like, oh, I'm so afraid of God, he's going to smite me if I don't do this. Fear of God is basically having a deep reverence for him. The root word that's used in Genesis chapter 22, verse 12 for fear, yare, the Hebrew word yare. This word generally conveys the idea of fear, awe, and reverence. And it encompasses the concept of respecting and revering and standing in awe of something or someone greater than oneself. And because he responds with the fear of the Lord, we read in Genesis chapter 22, verses 15 to 18, "And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, 'By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice.'" So we see that because of Abraham's fear, he chose to obey God, and because of his obedience, he was blessed. And not only was he blessed, the nations, the generations after him were blessed. See, the repeated word in this passage here is surely, and this word surely was not seen in the previous conversations that God had with Abraham regarding the covenant, because this is after this situation when he saw Abraham respond with the fear of the Lord and obey. That's when he knew that this man could be trusted with his divine plan. So, yeah, because Abraham had the fear of the Lord, he chose to be obedient, even when he was commanded to do something completely nonsensical to him and challenging, but he chose to respond in obedience. And like I said, as a result, God blessed him, and he was part of the legacy. We know him as one of the heroes of faith. So if we are to leave an impact, if we want to leave behind a legacy, we're going to have to go through tests. Like Abraham, we will go through tests that feels like it's beyond our capability to handle. We feel like we're going to be tested in things that are close to our heart. And when we are tested in such things, how do we respond? Do we respond with the fear of God? And at the end of the day, what are we prepared to give up? So to understand how Abraham could respond the way he did, and to God, we have to understand his backstory, what he's been through, his experiences. And so we're going to take a look at his backstory of how he became the God-fearing man that he was in Genesis 22. So first of all, I want to talk about growing in the fear of the Lord. Now, it is important to remember that Abraham didn't just go through one test in life. He didn't go through just a test of being tested to offer his son, Isaac, but he went through multiple tests. being asked to sacrifice Isaac wasn't the first test, and it probably was the last one recorded. So let's just go through some of the tests. So that was the test of leaving his homeland when God called him to leave behind his, everything that he was familiar with, his country, his relatives, his father's house, and go into the unknown. Then there was a test of trusting God's protection, where, on separate occasions he was going to different countries and he tried to pass her off as his sister, just in case he might, get killed for that. Then there's the test of faith in God's promise, where God promised Abraham that he would have descendants as many as, the stars, despite the age despite Abraham and Sarah being, quite aged. Then there's the test of Hagar and Ishmael, after making that covenant with Abraham, how he was going to have a son. There's Sarah, they're not really trusting in the Lord's provision. And so therefore I was like, hey, sleep with my maidservant and make that happen. Then there was the test of circumcision, where God established the covenant of circumcision with Abraham and commanded him to circumcise not only himself, but his male descendants and all the males in his household. Basically, this was physical sign of the covenant between Abraham and God, Abraham's household and God. And then there's the test of Sodom and Gomorrah, where God was revealing his plan to destroy the wicked cities. Now, in all these different tests, did Abraham waver? 100% he did. All right. In some situations, he seemed pretty brave, pretty fearless. Like, for example, when he was called to leave, what he was comfortable with into the unknown, he went with it. And then there was the whole circumcising himself and the males in his household. I think that takes a level of courage to do that, especially when the man is 99 years old, and it's not just him, but all the males in his household. And there was no handbook on how to do that. So I say the man was pretty fearless in that sense. And then you have him bargaining with God, trying to spare the righteous in Sodom. And then, so you have that, Abraham being quite, fearless. And then you have him also, having the wrong kind of fear. Maybe he didn't have enough fear of his wife because he tried to pass his wife off as his sister. I mean, all the married men here, if you try to pass off your wife as your sister just in case you might die, I think you will die first at the hand of your wife. All right? And also, I think in some situations, he might fear his wife too much because the wife is like, sleep with my maidservant and make that son happen. So I'm like, the guy had a weird relationship of fear with his wife. So, so I was thinking, as I was looking at Genesis 22, it's like, is fearing God something we can grow in, or is it something that just happens just like that, rather instantaneously? Because, I don't know, for me, it seems like Abraham grew from having the fear of man to having the fear of God. It looked as though it happened over time. And also, he didn't exactly have someone teach him, the statutes and the commandments of God. He didn't have a Moses, these are, the 10 commandments, follow these and you will live and prosper. He didn't have that. And if there's any concept of God that he had, it would come from the pagan cults around him. So I want to take some time right now to look at Abraham's direct interactions with God and how he responds, because I feel like that will show how his relationship with God progressed and grew. So his first interaction with God was in Genesis 12, when God calls him out and promises to make him a great nation, bless him, and make his name great. And so how does Abraham respond? He just goes. He just goes. At the age of 75, he took his nephew Lot and departed from his homeland. Then further on in the same chapter 12, Genesis 12, God speaks to Abraham again, promising to give the land to his offspring. His response? Builds an altar for God. In Genesis 13, God speaks to Abraham again after when Abraham and Lot separate into different lands, reiterating the promise that he is going to be giving the land to his descendants. How does Abraham respond? Builds another altar to him. Now, in Genesis 15, his interaction with the Lord is a little bit longer. And so God appears to Abraham in the vision and reaffirms his covenant about promising him a son and multiple descendants. And so it starts off 15, verse 1. The Lord, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. your reward shall be very great. Now, the word fear is used here. And actually, the root word, the Hebrew word is tira, and it's also derived from the root word yare, but it specifically means to fear, to be afraid, and is often used to describe a sense of dread or apprehension in the face of danger, something alarming, or a threatening situation. So the fact that God tells Abraham to not fear probably shows that Abraham was afraid of God or facing some sort of situation that is causing him fear. Because like when in that situation when God was speaking to Abraham just came out from defeating people to save his nephew, and then he just gave a tenth of his possessions to someone. So maybe he's feeling like, oh, am I going to face retribution from these people that I defeated? Maybe he's feeling a little bit lax. So maybe that's what is going on in his mind right now, just like fear, being afraid. So that's why God was like, fear not. Now, Abraham is a little bit more bold with his response. So in verse 2 of chapter 15, but Abraham said, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abraham said, "Behold, you've given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir." I mean, this is how I'm imagining Abraham sounding to God right now. But you see, God, he reaffirms his covenant. So the whole scenario is this, is that, Abraham, he heard, he had questions, and then he believed. We see that in Genesis 15:6. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. All right, so let's look at Genesis 17. Where God appears to Abraham again, and this is where he has a name change, changes his name to Abraham, and then establishes the covenant of circumcision. And like I mentioned, Abraham was 99 years old when the Lord appeared to him, and he fell on his face. Like he fell on his face, and he obeyed God's commandment and did as he was told. Then in Genesis 18, God appears to Abraham in the form of 3 visitors to inform him of first the impending birth of Isaac, and also discusses the judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. So here we have Abraham, how he responds is he intercedes for Sodom and Gomorrah. He bargains with God. He says, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes." All right, next interaction. God speaks to Abraham in Genesis 21 regarding Hagar and Ishmael. Sarah wants, Abraham to send away Hagar and Ishmael. So Abraham's like, "What do I do, God?" And then God's like, "Send them away. Listen to your wife." So, yeah. Then finally, in Genesis 22, when Abraham was called, he said, "Here am I." His response basically shows that he is ready, to obey, to surrender, to be examined by God. It really shows that he is a person of faith. And so when God asked for his son, at this point, he didn't bargain, he didn't intercede, he just went with it. Notice that this is something interesting that I found is that, from Abraham's first conversation with God at the age of 75 till his death at 175, there are only 8 recorded conversations between God and Abraham. I mean, it's a span of 100 years, hearing from God like 8 times. I mean, this really showcases that this is a man of faith, that only hearing from God 8 times and still like holding strong to him. That's next level of faith right there. If I don't hear from God in like 8 days, I'm like, "God, do you even love me still? Like, do you still even exist?" I mean, the man, 8 times in the span of 100 years, but still is known as a man of faith. I mean, this really exemplifies how he's a man of faith. So, as I'm looking at the different interactions of Abraham, how he responded to God, and you can really see how his faith progressed, how he really grew in his relationship with God. And again, it seems to me that he grew in his understanding of God, and how he also is growing in the fear of the Lord. What it really means to be motivated by the right fear of God. Like, he knows God to be the judge. He knows God to be the everlasting God. And actually, there are verses in chapter 22, revolving the story around sacrificing Isaac, that seems to indicate that Isaac really wasn't going to die. Like, he would say, when he was talking to the young men, he said, "I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And then when Isaac was asking, his father, like, so where's the lamb? Where's the sacrifice? He says, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And if you look at Hebrews 11, verses 17 to 19, when it's talking about Abraham, it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. I think for me, the turning point for Abraham and his faith was when he believed God in Genesis 15:6. He believed God. He takes God at his word. There's a difference between believing in God and believing God. Like, believing in God basically refers to acceptance that God exists, that, he's around and, he's real and he's present. But then believing God is not only do you believe that God exists, that you trust in his word, you trust in his character, you trust in his promises, that it involves a commitment to follow and obey his teachings and commandments. It's basically an active faith that has a part to play in the way we live our lives and the decisions that we make. So believing God and having the fear of God is deeply interconnected. You see, like, the fear of God is viewed as an essential foundation for building a thriving relationship with God. And it also corresponds to having a deep sense of respect, reverence and awe of God's divine power and omnipotence. So when you believe God, you're bound to take his words seriously. And, this leads to having a fear of the Lord and really wanting to align your will to his will, to live your life according to his word. So God testing Abraham in Genesis 22 was seeing if he had the fear of the Lord. So, interestingly enough, like, this whole time when God was speaking to Abraham, or at least the times that was noted down, it was all about blessing him. It was all about making a covenant with him. And so actually, one might be thinking like, okay, so is Abraham only, obeying God because of what he could get out of God? Is it because, like, I will be blessed if I were to obey him? So did he actually, was he actually driven by the fear of God, or was he actually driven by potential personal gain? Right? Was he actually driven by love for God, or was he driven by the love of the promises of God? See, you can see that he was ready to give up his son. He was ready to sacrifice the thing closest to his heart. So, God, he wasn't looking at, what he was giving. He was looking at the heart. He was seeing that how Abraham was driven by the right kind of fear, a fear that loves God. So, yeah, that was Abraham. He had the fear of the Lord, and he was driven by that. And because of that, he could obey God. Now, I want to talk about living in the fear of the Lord. Now, the first mention of the concept of fearing God actually appears in Genesis 22, which is kind of interesting. So there's this principle of first mention, is that when an important word or concept occurs for the first time in the Bible, the context in which it occurs sets the pattern for its primary usage and development all through the rest of Scripture. And actually, there are two other concepts that are first mentioned in this chapter too. It's love and worship. So fearing God, loving God, worshiping God, it's all like interconnected. I mean, they form the foundation of our relationship with God. It basically shapes the way we act and the way we think. So you cannot love God and, fear without fearing him. You cannot worship God without loving him. And you cannot fear God and not love and worship him. It's all interconnected. And that's how living in the fear of the Lord looks like. The fear of the Lord, provided the foundation of God, of Abraham's love and worship. That's how he could, act the way he did, bring his son to the Lord. That's how he could just, willingly obey God, even though it didn't make sense. And yeah, that's why living in the fear was enabling him to do the hardest thing, to give up something that was closest to his heart, trusting that God's plan is greater than his own. I mean, he's asked to give up the most precious possession, but yet he trusted that God, your plan is greater than my plan. Now, if we were to look at the word love that was used for the first time in this context, it's first mentioned between, the love that's first mentioned is between a father and a son, and used in connection with the sacrificial offering of the only and beloved son. And it's, the deep love of a father and a son is inferred to be representative of the most complete and meaningful concept of love, and basically the root and foundation of all other types of love. Love is so deeply related to sacrifice, because when you love something so deeply, something has to be sacrificed, right? I mean, either your time, your resources, your sleep. When you love something so deeply, something has to be sacrificed. And so Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son, Isaac, his only son whom he loves, his love for God trumped that and led him to be able to obey even when faced with that challenging command. And so Abraham's devotion was greater than his love for his son. And Abraham was only able to do that because he had the fear of the Lord. Sacrifice is a tangible expression of our love to God. It involves, again, giving up something so valuable, so dear, out of reverence and commitment. Now, the other word that was mentioned the first time, as I mentioned, was worship. We see this for the first time in Genesis 22, verse 5. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And the Hebrew word that's used for worship means to bow down, prostrate oneself. Basically, to worship God is more than just singing songs. It's really to bow down to his will, to recognize and acknowledge that his will is best. So the question would be, why would Abraham use the word worship when he was asked to go sacrifice his son? I think, like, to Abraham, worship is an act of surrender. It's an act of devotion, even in the face of a great challenge. Basically, it's emphasizing the nature of his actions and heart posture behind him, that everything that he's doing is a worship unto the Lord. Again, like I said, he could have done otherwise. He could have ran off with his son and hopefully, God wouldn't find him and leave him alone. But he knew that what he was about to do was not a task, it wasn't an obligation, but it was an act of worship unto the Lord. An act of devotion, an act of reverence. And again, he was only able to do this because he had the fear of the Lord. Obedience was a measure of how he feared God. That's how we saw he had the fear of God. And he was able to trust in God's sovereignty and to submit to God's will. And I think his trust overflowed to his own son. Now, I guess, when we read about the story, whether in Sunday school, whatever, like, we think in our head, like, Isaac's just this, child that's placed upon the sacrifice. Isaac was, according to, I guess, what people studies, like, Isaac was at least 12, between the ages of 12, and also potentially a man in his 30s. Imagine a grown man, on an altar. If my dad were to, offer me as a sacrifice, I would forget this, Dad, I'm getting out of here, just step outside. I can very well step out of this, and also I can take down my dad too, right? I'm a strong man, right? Technically, I will never take down my dad. I will never take down my dad, cannot. But, I'm just imagining, Isaac, right? He could technically take out his dad, but he must have seen how Abraham lived his life in trusting God and, obeying God. And that must have overflowed into his life, knowing that, I guess, it's contagious. Wow, if my dad can trust God the Father, I can trust my dad, right? So I guess in a sense, how you live your life for your children inspires them and influences them as well on how trust looks like. I would say that Abraham was challenged in so many aspects of his life, right? But I think the one thing I would say he's challenged in is, seeing the Lord provide. When he was stepping out into the unknown, he had to trust God's provision, right? I don't know where I'm going. You got to make it, clear for me and provide for my needs. When he was stepping into Egypt and Gerar, where he was, trying to pass off Sarah as his sister, he wasn't really trusting God's protection. There have been so many moments where he was challenged in God's provision. stepping to unknown. When God told him, like, you're going to have a son, but like, really, God, is it coming? Is it coming soon? And then, in the moments where he tried to take things in his hands, he faced the retribution of, his actions. But the moment where he released it to God and chose to obey him, he saw God multiply, God bless him. And so, and at this point, when he chose to, submit to God's will, like, all right, if you ask for my son, here it is. I'm not going to question. I'm not going to bargain. I'm not going to, plead for it. God saw that he had fear. He obeyed. And God multiplied. God blessed him. God provided. I mean, it was on that mountain where the phrase, the Lord will provide. Jehovah Jireh, right? So going back to the principle of first mention, Genesis 22 sets the tone of what living in the fear of God looks like. It involves loving him. It involves worshiping him. It involves just responding to him in obedience and trusting in his sovereignty. Now, like I said, fear is a natural human, emotion. And that evolved as a protective mechanism to, help us to respond to potential threats and to, that we don't make dumb life decisions. But the question that you might want to ask yourself today is, do you have the fear of the Lord? Or maybe a better question to ask yourself is, has your fear of the Lord grown cold? If we want to do great things for God, if we want to be entrusted to do, be part of his amazing plan, he's not focused on your talents. He's not focused on your abilities. He's focused on whether you have the fear of God. He wants to see if you have the obedience that stems from a fear that fears God, an obedience that stands in awe of God and trusts him. In order for God to use us, we're bound to face tests. It's unavoidable. We can't get away with it. And we're bound to face tests, especially in the things that we love, that we hold close to our heart. And it's only then when God can trust you with his divine plan. And I forget if Pastor Ed said this from the pulpit, or he said this in one of our staff meetings, or Pastor and me. He said, what is not tested cannot be trusted. So if you want to do great things for God, you got to go through some tests. I mean, are you going to trust a doctor who hasn't done his qualifications? Not quite likely, Are you going to trust a physical trainer who looks as though he can't lift anything? Not exactly either. So what is not tested cannot be trusted. Again, it's so easy to do what God commands when you understand what he's, when you understand what he's saying and you can see the end goal. But when he throws out something to you like what he did with Abraham, it's going to be like, oh, I don't know, man. It's hard. I don't understand. God, why are you asking me to do that? I mean, it's going to be hard when you're thrown out with something, thrown by God with something that doesn't make sense. When you don't understand, when it seems as though he's, like he's saying to do something that draws you away from what you feel like he's called you to do. But do we fear God enough to do what he says, even when it costs us something? Even when we have to step out of our comfort zone, even when it's inconvenient. What is the motivating factor in our relationship with God? Is it our faith in God, or is it in what he can provide? Do we see love as transactional, or do we obey God because we hope to gain something? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Abraham started off with, I guess because God is going to bless me, I'm going to go out, because God's going to multiply my offspring, I'm going to go out. But I think it's throughout his life experiences where he chooses to trust God, where he sees that God is not just a transactional God. I'm loving God because I fear him. And I want to obey him. I want to submit, to his authority. See, the right kind of fear believes that we lack nothing, that God is a God who is full of abundance, that the Lord will provide all we need. That is the right kind of fear. So the question is, are you driven by the right kind of fear of God? Because I know I was driven by the wrong fear for the longest time. I mean, I saw God as transactional. Like, for example, only one of the main reasons why I said yes to Jesus when I was a kid was because if I say yes to Jesus, then I'm not going to burn in hell, right? So that was transactional, right? So say yes to Jesus and then, fire insurance, sorted, right? So that's, my idea of what it looks like to live for Jesus. Yes, all right. So for me, it's like, if I do this, if I obey this, therefore God will bless me. I mean, I think the whole concept of just doing stuff for God was just so ingrained in me. It got to the point where, one of the word of knowledge was eye floaters, right? So when I first got them, I panicked. Okay, I thought that was a disease in my brains or my eyes because I saw it floating. I was like, oh my goodness, like I'm gonna die, and there are worms eating away in my brain. And then I panicked. But we went to the optometrist, and the optometrist said like, oh, you have eye floaters. I was like, oh, what even is that? And then I remember like I was the speaker. He was sharing about how sicknesses were 70% spiritual and 30% physical. And I thought to myself, all right, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna confess every single sin and hopefully be healed in Jesus' name. So what did I do? Took out a piece of paper and wrote down, Dear Jesus, I am so sorry for, listed all possible sins I could think of. Write it down. I don't remember what I wrote, but I just wrote down everything that I could remember. I think I was in my 20s. So whatever, for 20 years, I wrote down, in Jesus' name, amen. And I expected to be healed. Was I healed? Not really. And I was like, Lord, I went to the speaker. I said, hey, you said that sicknesses were 70% spiritual, 30%, physical. So I've done my part. I've said, Jesus, I apologize for everything. So what's up with that? I didn't realize that I saw God as transactional, that in order to get God to do for me something, I had to do something. He made me realize that I did not understand the Father heart of God, that I was treating him like a vending machine, that if I did A, I'll get B. If I did C, I'll get D. Do I still struggle with, having the right fear of God? I mean, I think I do at times. Sometimes the fear of man compels me more than the fear of God, not gonna lie. It's a journey that I'm still growing in. But, when you have the right fear of God, that's when you can be like Abraham and say like, you know what? The Lord will provide even though I'm lacking. Even though I'm seeking healing in my life, even I'm seeking provision for a breakthrough, hey, I have to fear the Lord. I revere him. I'm going to trust that he will provide. And I'm going to obey him and submit to his will no matter what. And when we have the fear of the Lord, we will find it natural to love him. We'll find it natural to worship him. It's all interconnected. Like I mentioned, you can't separate one or the other. You can't obey God and then not love him. You can't worship God and not fear him. It's all interconnected. And when you are driven by the right fear of God, that is the natural response. You love him. You worship him. You trust in him. You submit to his sovereignty. You choose to obey him. And so, I don't know, for me, one of the things that, I realized is that, I was on a plane once, and, the planes, they will always tell you to close the shutters and, especially if it's a long flight, but I'm the kind of person that likes to see what's outside. So I was lifted up the shade, and I saw the mountains. We were flying over Alaska, and I saw the mountains. I thought to myself, wow, this is so beautiful. And honestly, the three feelings of love, reverence, and worship happened at the same time for me, because I was in awe of who God is. And I couldn't just help but love him for who he is. And I couldn't just help but worship him. And, I want to be remembered for someone, to be someone who loved God, who revered him, who worshiped him no matter what. I mean, yes, like I said, it's a journey, but I want to be remembered for that. I don't know what you want to be remembered for, but that's what I want to be remembered for, to be a person who feared God, loved God, worshiped him, and trusted in his provision no matter what. I want to end with a quote by Billy Graham. He said, to fear God is not to shrink back from him in terror. To fear God is to have a deep reverence for him and to stand in awe at his holiness and majesty and power and love. Only then will we love and serve and worship him as we should. Can I invite us to stand? We're going to go into time of ministry and worship. So I don't know what you are trusting in the Lord for today, whether it be a breakthrough in your lives or for God to provide, or maybe for you today, you're like, I don't know, I need the fear of the Lord in my life. If it's growing cold, we're here to pray for you. But right now, we're just going to spend some time in worship and ministry.